This is Daniel Fagella, and welcome back to The Trajectory. We're continuing our focus on destinations, the future combinations of man and machine that might be preferable or not preferable in the future. And our guest this week is Jaan Tallinn. Jaan was the co-founder of Skype. He has for around a decade been the most prolific funder of AI safety research. And he is also on the United Nations AI Council formed by their Secretary General, the first ever of its kind at the United Nations. When I first met Jaan 4 or 5 years ago, we did our first interview on my AI in Business podcast. AI was a little bit farther off into the distance, and the topics that we covered were a little bit different than what we covered today. Nowadays, Jaan has a pretty firm focus on governance in the near term and what it might look like to steer towards safety of artificial general intelligence. He's certainly not in the accelerationist camp, as you can tell from this interview. So I've got a couple comments to say about what was covered, but I'm very grateful I was able to have Jaan on so early in this series to directly follow Yoshua Bengio himself. Lots of interesting nuggets here, lots of good links in the show notes to what Jaan is working on. Without further ado, let's fly right in. This is Jaan Tallinn on The Trajectory. So Jaan, welcome to the program. Good to chat with you again.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a little over 4 years since our last conversation, which was actually at the World Government Summit in person in Dubai. A little bit crazy to think that was half a decade ago. I guess everything pre-COVID feels like it was, a full 10 years back. A lot has changed since then. A lot has changed out in the world in terms of LLMs and, the release of ChatGPT. And also some of your perspectives have shifted and really tilted more towards AI risk. We're definitely going to talk about the big picture, where we want to go with AI. But I want to start with what's changed for you, your own personal perspective is, you've been a big part of sort of that call for an AI pause. What were the main levers that adjusted your thinking towards hedging downside as a real emphasis right now?
I think the really big thing that has changed in the last 4 years, which basically the period starts after the big event, which in retrospect was like pivotal. The event was this paper from Google Research called Transformers, Attention is All You Need. Because that basically started this new paradigm in AI, in frontier AI development, really, that you just need to have like a simple 200-line program, and then you just throw like megatons of compute and data at it, and just leave it unattended for months, and then look at like what has grown in the cellar, open the hood, and then try to like tame it. So 4 years ago, I still was on the edge. Like it wasn't obvious. Like there was like sort of unanswered question, like is like deep learning all you need, or are we still missing some really big components that we need to like spend decades to invent? And I had like genuine uncertainty there. I mean, I still have some uncertainty left. It's possible that GPT-5 for some reason kind of fails to dazzle and suddenly like this entire LLM thing fizzles out. But like this is not the way I would bet. I don't think we see signs of that.
Yeah, and so my interview literally 12 hours ago, my interview wrapped up with Bengio, who obviously was a big part of the attention sort of hard research. Did you read that paper from Google and right then and there think to yourself, whoa, this might really be a game changer? Or did it take you to use ChatGPT and leverage some of these LLM tools and get an understanding of what they could do in terms of concocting new bioweapons or spinning up an entire fiction novel or what have you? Like what was the threshold for you?
It definitely was gradual because again, like 4 years ago, the paper was already out there, but I think even the authors didn't expect this to be such transformative event, even though transformation was in the name of the paper.
Yeah.
Personally, I think like the signs, I think it was GPT-2 or the period around like the debate about should be GPT-3 be released was when I really started to pay attention. Because one thing that did take me by surprise was that the grammar was solved. Like GPT-3 no longer made grammar mistakes. It's kind of like more correct in grammar than I am in
Yeah.
English grammar, perhaps even in Estonian. So that was surprising. I did not expect machines to get there so quickly. And then when I was about a year ago, a little bit less than that, I saw GPT-4 transcripts. I did not have access to GPT-4, but I saw some transcripts, and they were like, okay, this is really serious now. I should start thinking about like how to kind of like step back and reassess what I'm doing.
Yeah, and was it simply the fact that it was vastly more capable than you had expected, or was it something about the inherent uncontrollability of it that sort of shocked you? What were the main levers there?
So the main thing that did surprise me about the GPT-4 transcripts was the jump in capabilities compared to GPT-3. It just like saw the consistency and usefulness in many areas, although not perfect one, obviously, but just to see that like jump up really quickly, and if it just calculated what was the looked at like the time period between the releases and just extrapolated ahead, then at that point became like unclear, like whether we still have like a decade left, or is that the last one?
Yeah. Okay. So, and I think you're not alone in feeling that way. It's interesting how the science and the abstract often doesn't really move the needle for people. It's actually seeing stuff in person. I think that was the big deal for Hinton. I think that was the big deal for Bengio. And it sounds like on some level that was the same case for you. And this takes us, we're going to get a little bit into sort of maybe how governance looks like from here. But I'm a big believer, and essentially this entire series and media channel are all about getting an understanding of where we ultimately want to go. I think that there are values decisions that sort of undergird policy decisions. You ask somebody, how do you want to govern AI, or what should we do with this policy decision? That'll tell you which direction they want to go in the maze, but it doesn't really tell you where they want to arrive in terms of a grander long-term future. When you and I chatted 4 years ago, there was certainly some addressing of AI risks, and clearly even back then you had been one of the premier funders of sort of AI risk vastly before it became a popular topic. But there was also a lot of talk between us around a grand post-human intelligent sentient future. The idea that, there were amoebas once, now there's humanity. You and I can enjoy this intellectual conversation. We can enjoy poetry. We can, build automobiles. We can do whatever we want to do. And eventually there will be astronomically higher versions and permutations of that might be worthy. So there was some enthusiasm about getting there while still bearing risks in mind. I'm interested now in sort of where you see yourself on that trajectory matrix that I'd sort of sent along. On the governance side and on sort of the progression side. So we've got total laissez-faire, some degree of collaboration, then a little bit more control, not quite authoritarianism, but something a little closer to global governance. And then we have pure preservation of hominids as they are, a little bit of progression into keeping our nature but extending it, and then ascension, which is really the blast off into something drastically different and hopefully higher and greater. Where do you see yourself plotted there, at least now? And has that changed in the last couple of years?
I think there are like two really separate, although like somewhat overlapping, unfortunately overlapping questions.
Yes.
One is like, what would I like to see as a long-term future for humanity?
Yeah.
And the other is like, what do I think should be done in order to survive this acute risk period that we're in?
Let's talk about both. That sounds great.
Like imagine like going to a doctor and getting like a cancer diagnosis, and like then like there are very separate questions about what you should do to get rid of the cancer, and then what you should do once you're successfully conquered the cancer.
Yeah.
So I think that's like same situation here. So unfortunately, I do think like trying to take this like libertarian hammer, which I'm like otherwise would be like very sympathetic to. It just doesn't fit this kind of like square, like the round hammer doesn't fit the square.
I'm with you. Yeah.
But like that, and the reason very simple. Like the reason is that destruction is easier than construction.
Yep.
So like there are things called negative externalities. So like when Facebook releases Llama 2, which it did, it means that like the worst possible actor now has access to Llama 2. Models that are slightly more powerful than Llama 2 because they can improve on that, which it's unclear. Like it's kind of like, in some ways it's kind of principled and kind of ideologically pure way of doing things, but is that going to be safer trajectory? I doubt it. So yeah, like kind of answer a question. I do think that in the long run, I am sort of like libertarian in kind of making sure that everyone has kind of unconstrained abilities to kind of have their own have control over their own life trajectory, etc. But I do think it's kind of important to not ignore the negative externalities. So like if somebody really wants to destroy the world, we shouldn't make that easy. So it's because like there are other people who don't want that.
Yes. And I guess, well, this takes us back to where you'd find yourself on the plot. You have sympathies with the libertarian sort of cause, as I think many people do, but also sincere troubles with having a very willy-nilly, open-ended, open source approach to these very dangerous technologies. Yeah. Where do you see yourself? Do you eventually still see ascension being glorious and worthy for the trajectory of intelligence itself, but you simply want to pause it? Or are you sort of leaning away from those grander explosions of intelligence due to the risk for hominids as they are? Where do you sit on the matrix itself, if you were just going to put a finger there?
So, I mean, yes, I do think that the kind of sentience is good. Having like sort of like flourishing future for sentient beings where they don't have to suffer and possibly kind of like populate the rest of the universe that seems to be dead for now.
Yep.
That's kind of like something to aspire for. Like it's possible that I'm like making some moral mistakes when I can imagine that kind of future, but it's possible that I imagine some kind of physically impossible or inconsistent thing. But like this is at least like aspirationally something that can be debated. However, everything should kind of take a backseat to the fact that we are about to be wiped out by non-conscious machines.
Yes. Okay. So this is an interesting point, and so I'll really kind of flesh out where you stand now, and we'll get a little bit down to brass tacks on the governance side, which you've helped to found many of the groups working on some of the policy work here, and we're going to get into the meat and potatoes. But clarifying the position, there are increasingly, and this was not the case when you and I chatted years ago, a crowd that is very much in the pedal to the metal at any cost camp. Almost comically so, almost like a caricature. I don't know how much of it is real or how much of it is genuine, but it wouldn't surprise me if it really is quite genuine. This idea of let's blast off whatever is the most capable and intelligent thing, because the overall net goal of that will be, great. And for some of these people, there's a naive notion that, of course, humanity would be treated really well by any future intelligence. And then for others, there's just a blatant notion of, doesn't matter that much how humanity is treated. If the universe is populated by something, that's great. There's other people who make the argument that if right now what we have for AI, this permutation of what we have for AI, we don't know, A, if it is sentient or has the ability to blossom into sentience. We have no idea. It might just be dead, the same as the rest of the universe, as you brought up. And also, it may not expand its capability set and optimize for high and lofty things. You and I, Jaan, we optimize for very different things than rodents. So rodents have like a very limited number of things they can optimize for. You might decide you want to get into oil painting. You might want to raise your children in a certain way. You might want to give back to your community in an interesting way. You might want to invent something in terms of technology. You've done plenty of that in the earlier parts of your career. We have this wide berth of exploring the state space of good beyond what rodents could do, and that's beautiful. Mm-hmm. Some people make the argument that AI won't necessarily do that. If we just take some hard-coded AI, it might be hyper-optimizing for something really minimal and not exploring the state space of good. Are these the core trepidations of why you don't want to see the blast off now? Or is it purely the risk to humans, or is it a bit of both? I'd love to get your stance.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of important to be quantitative at this point. Like there is this like very reasonable question, like, so how much existential risk is okay? My friend Andrew Critch just asked it on Twitter about like how much risk of everyone dying this decade should humanity take in order to kind of address like perennial problems of that we have lived with for our entire existence, such as like disease, making sure that like nobody who doesn't want to die doesn't have to die. Basically, would get life extension, completely disease-free, and kind of abundance in resources. That is like a potential like really good world. So how much cost would be willing to pay for that that kind of potentially glorious future? And I think it's quite often that the kind of differences in opinion aren't kind of qualitative, they're just quantitative. They're like people who are just more risk-taking. They say like, this sounds so good future that like I'm totally willing to like sacrifice like 99 probability of this like mundane and mundane world that's full of suffering, etc. That's not doesn't seem very worthwhile. Yep. But like the typical answer in Andrew Critch's poll was less than 1%. So like we should kind of be like at least 99% confident that we're not going to die this decade in order in exchange for the future of this glorious promise for this glorious future. It's like Faustian deal almost.
Yeah.
And I think Scott Aronson, the quantum physicist who now works at OpenAI, he also had a essay about this and or a blog post where he said that his Faustian parameter, as he called it, is 2%. He's willing to take like 2% risk with his life and also the lives of his kids. Like do like a biased coin flip with 2%, everyone dies. 98%, like there's going to be a glorious future. So I don't think it's like unreasonable to have like this kind of payoff. But like one big argument is that can we get a better deal? Like what if we don't have to like decide right now? What if we like postpone things like for 1 year, 2 years, perhaps a decade, perhaps like 5 decades? Perhaps the chances of survival would be much, much, much better. And then like, so that's like the sort of rationale for things like pausing.
I'm with you. And I think it's great to be able to quantify things when it's possible. I suspect, your Aronson's notion of kind of the 2%, when somebody says, okay, we're past the 2% threshold or doesn't, even that is pretty fuzzy stuff, right? I mean, we can be like, I'm going to think about it in terms of percentages, but those percentages are based on my goddamn feelings.
Percentages necessarily always are.
And when you
is always subjective.
when you work at the organization most likely to build the deity, you may lean in the direction of, oh, it's not that dangerous. And I'm not saying that Scott is guilty of anything. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's natural for humans. I think the self-interest of people is something we should just embrace and just deal with. That's quite natural. So I'm with you, but I also think obviously those things are tough to pin down. In terms of so we're going to get into the idea of this long pause. Final bit of clarification. In terms of that glorious future, for some people, the main priority in the big picture, let's just get wacky and let's say 1,000 years from now. I think that's a little too wacky, but let's just throw it out there. For some people, the main priority 1,000 years from now is, hey, everybody who wants to stay alive forever as a human can stay alive. They all walk around in the world of atoms just like you and I do now, except we have more food and we have more fun and whatever. And that's the main priority 1,000 years from now is hominids, kind of as they are, being able to be as happy as they want to be and maybe not die, or certainly not die of things, diseases that might be simple to cure for a powerful intelligence. For others, the population of the stars is really the bigger picture, the blossoming from kind of rodentia to man, from man to whatever is vastly beyond us in terms of exploring the state space of good. Do you even see those two as compatible? Because I know there are folks who say, hey, if we hand the baton to whatever could do the amazing blossoming things beyond us to the degree to which we have blossomed beyond crickets, that thing is really unlikely to care very much about the safety of hominids. So we should accept that when the baton passes hands, we should be ready to bow out and hope that it's going to be on good terms, but we should understand that we really are not going to have predictability and kindness from such a machine. Do you think that such a possibility of both of those goods is even reasonable? Or are you also of the belief that when the baton passes hands, we're going to have to sort of accept the cards that were dealt after that?
Again, there are like multiple questions here. Like, I think it's the default indeed is like very, I think like Jeff Hinton said that like there aren't many kind of examples of like less intelligent species controlling more intelligent species. So like I think that should be the kind of the default expectation. However, saying that okay, we're just almost certainly going to die now, and like there's nothing we can do, I think that's just like just giving up the fight without even trying, which is just also unreasonable. I think that's like very important difference between kind of super intelligent aliens. Like if you see like a interstellar ship heading our way, like I think we should be more than a little uneasy about this, because there's like civilization coming that's more advanced than we are. We don't have interstellar ships.
Yeah.
But like there's an important difference with AI. There are multiple important differences with kind of biological aliens and AI. One is that goes like the wrong way, which is like AI is likely going to be more different than biological aliens for multiple reasons. But like one thing that one piece of good news is that we have some control over what kind of AI we are going to get here, rather than. But like whereas if we are visited by aliens, we probably have very little control about what kind of aliens we're going to get. So like we should kind of at least try to use that degree of freedom to try to pick out kind of these alien silicon minds from the mind space that are kind of more agreeable with a future that we consider good. And unfortunately, the current AI paradigm that was kind of ushered in, I mean, with deep learning already, but like especially accelerated with the latest unsupervised learning paradigm, that's not very compatible with exercising this degree of freedom.
Yeah. It seems to me like if we were to explore that state space of minds and we stretch out 1,000 years, the best case scenario for hominids like you and me, Jaan, for little sentiences like you and I, would be, I've thought about this as much as I can. I'd love to know if you have a different take before we get into policy. The best case scenario might be our individual consciousness gets instantiated in some other substrate, and we get to experience as much infinite bliss and as much of the qualia catalog as we could possibly want to explore inside of some glorious uploaded hyper bliss that might be a simulation of a trillion years or something like that, in the size of a sugar cube maybe, and that AGI would permit for that as it goes and does vastly more important things. I'm happy to concede, maybe you're not, that there are probably more important things than maintaining an instantiation of a Dan Fagella consciousness when there are drastically super intelligent entities trying to do like escape the heat death of the universe, do really important things that you and I can't talk about, just like crickets can't talk about this conversation you and I are having now. My guess is my priority level is going to be low, but the most I think I could hope for would be to be uploaded into some state of bliss for as long as possible until that compute kind of dissipates, and then that would be the grand hope in terms of what us as humans and our individual sentiences could aim for. Would you see something different in terms of, hey, as much as we can hope for humans? Go ahead, please lay it on me.
I think it's a little bit kind of like under ambitious.
Wow, all right.
Like, I think kind of like few important considerations. We seem to be getting to the bottom of the laws of physics in this universe. So it's possible that there are still kind of like, I mean, we know that they're not fully consistent, right? So there must be some gaps in them. But it looks pretty likely that things like speed of light is a fundamental constraint in this universe that AI will not be able to violate, and things like that, kind of conservation of momentum, basically really, really fundamental laws of physics that will A, constrain AI, and B, we are already aware of. So in some ways, we are already playing in the big boys league because we are aware of the fundamental constraints that will be shared by that. We are likely aware of the fundamental constraints. So I think it's a little bit underselling humanity, saying that, well, we in principle cannot have any imagination of what they would be doing. Well, in some sense, yes, but we can reason about them using the things that we already know about laws of physics. The other thing is the Church-Turing thesis and the notion of Turing completeness. Yes. So any computation in principle can be done by human with paper and pencil, and we are aware of that fact again. So it's I think David Deutsch, Oxford philosopher, who I think is very confused about many things, but one thing he doesn't seem to be confused of is this notion of Turing completeness. And he really harps this point that look, humans have graduated. We are now Turing complete. We know things that in some sense there's nothing out there that humans cannot in principle not know. And I do think this is a very important point that he makes.
I suspect that there are future entities, not just with 5 billion times more memory than you and I, but with millions and millions of more sensory experiences, and an ability to be physically instantiated in a million places at once, and to have permutations of mind space so wildly, radically different from anything that's biologically evolved that we couldn't put words to it. And my supposition is that we would not be intellectually on par or able to grasp that stuff. But you may be right. Anything that such an entity could imagine, we could. I look at what would be seen as the eternal laws of physics to a cricket or to a rodent, and how many of those do we violate on a regular basis? What did they think?
Crickets and rodents are not Turing complete. That's really important distinction. Sure, there are things that we can keep only 7 things in our mind at once, right? So clearly we have practical limitations, but the question is limitations in principle. I think these are much stronger. I think mouse cannot in principle program, whereas humans can.
I think to have any line in the sand and be like, aha, our species, really luckily, is past the magic line where all future things are conceivable. Not dolphins, though, but people definitely are. If that's the case, I say more power to us. I have no idea, but you may very much be right there. And
again, this is not my argument. This is David Deutsch's argument that I really happen to agree with.
Got it. Yep. So I'll have to take a look. He actually is on Twitter, which apparently you know of some things that people tweet, but you're not there. That's probably the best.
Some of his books.
The best of both worlds. Yeah, I know he's a prolific author as well. So with that said, we'll get a little bit into governance before we wrap. You've done some new thinking on this, and since our last discussion, you've really shifted your core priorities around handling these risks, not wanting to blast off too quickly, and taking this time to think. We brought up the idea of a long reflection from Toby Ord in the episode with Bengio. He's pretty congenial to that. It sounds like you are too. What are some of the things that for you, governance-wise, are really most critical to think about, given the risks and the upsides that we're facing?
I think sort of on a meta level, I think it seems too important to have any AI governance at all. Just have one thing at least that is AI specific. I mean, Chinese already have them, so good for them, right?
Yes.
Whereas EU is kind of trying to get over the last hump of it and kind of establish the AI Act. We'll see how it goes. I think US is has nothing. So it's I think just have something. And I think one good candidate to kind of start off is just make it illegal to deceive people about the origin of AI outputs of AI. So if there's a video, it should be illegal. If there's an AI generated video or text or picture, it should be illegal to deceive people that this was generated by humans.
Got it. So baseline, some monicum of governance in some way, shape, or form, do you see this as pretty likely to fit under the traditional IGO camp? There's some much more noise in the United Nations about AI now. The OECD is pretty far along. Do you see that living there, or do you see this mostly really getting pushed, in the U.S. Senate, driven by the populace? Where do you see the most important momentum having to begin on exactly those points?
I mean, Europe already has some momentum, right? So I think that is great. It's kind of unclear, like how long it will still take to get something in place. And also one thing that I give OpenAI credit for is like their sort of strategy of inoculation, as they call it, seems to be working.
Talk to me about this.
Like they got a reaction from the planet to releasing GPT. But I think it's important to give people time. So like instead of say that I'm just inoculating and then follow it up before people and governments, etc., have time to react to the new situation, just follow it up with a model that's 10 times more powerful, and then again 10 times more powerful. That's not the longer inoculation strategy. That's sabotage.
And you also have the idea of kind of VTO committees for AI. This is on your own personal priorities, which you have updated on your website. We'll make sure that's in the show notes. Anybody listening in can look up Jaan Tallinn's priorities. That feels like it would have to be some kind of an international governance dynamic.
Yes.
How would you see that planning out? What would that look like ideally?
So on my current kind of priorities, and these are just a couple of weeks old, so I haven't made much progress on them yet, but so they are sort of like a northern stars for me right now. Some of the priorities are more realistic, like this kind of making impersonation illegal. That I think there's quite a lot of consensus around this. Whereas I think one of the most pie in the sky proposals is to have this diverse veto committees. So the rationale there is that we are unfortunately in a situation where very few companies and people in them are taking risks with everyone else without the rest of the planet really realizing even that there is such thing happening, that their lives are being risked now, or at least people like Sam Altman are deciding how much risk to take with people in, I don't know, Somalia and
anywhere, the whole
planet.
Anywhere
really, anywhere in the universe. In our future so it's first of all, it's important to just realize that this is a situation that we're in, and because that's just more dignified to kind of understand that unfortunately we're in a situation where few people are making such decisions, and then sort of next step after that would be to actually kind of reverse it and make sure that these are, again, I think it's a reasonable, it's a non-trivial question about how much risk should we be taking if there's a potential or promise for really glorious upside. And I totally can see much worse situations than Sam Altman, who I kind of somewhat know and I can't say anything kind of super bad about him, right? So I can certainly imagine much worse people in his position making that crucial decision. But I think it's much more better to have some kind of more principled mechanism where we have more representative committees of people whose lives are actually asked to pay the cost, to have a decision-making mechanism to decide this, okay, how much risk we should be taking with the lives of kids.
Yeah, and it's, man, is it messy, right? I mean, because if now you have committees, whether it's in Somalia or something else, where if I can get enough of my constituents in Papua New Guinea to say no to this thing, then some big company in the United States or in China has to then not do it anymore. Mm-hmm. The degree of wild demagoguery that will happen in all of these different spaces of how they communicate those risks to kind of their people, and sort of how they want to wield and steer things. would become really, really intense. But I guess to your point, maybe that's better than, you know, a small
Exactly.
set of companies that are
the sort of low ambition thing here to do is just improve the current situation, which is really, really, really bad. To be clear, not the worst. There could be even worse situation where like someone who literally doesn't care about humanity. And I know there are some people in AI who literally do not care about humanity. If they would be, making those decisions, that definitely would be worse. But I think the more ambitious plan is to like think about, okay, yes, like the usual failure modes of democracy are things like populism and kind of like non-representativism and kind of propaganda and mind washing and things like that. Are there ways how we being aware that these are problems, can we actually design around them? Can we use things like blockchain, for example, to make sure that these things cannot be manipulated easily? There is this thing called MATSI, minimum anti-collusion infrastructure.
Okay, I haven't heard of it. I'll have to check that out.
That kind of uses blockchain to make voting in a way that is kind of cannot be tampered with. So yeah, perhaps there are like ways kind of to go around the usual traditional problems that human politics has had.
Bypass some of those risks. I've kind of thought about the idea of eventually there having to be, and maybe you're imagining it slightly differently, but I think this will be good. We'll wrap up on one final point after this, but just to clarify what you're addressing, which I think is really important, this idea of something beyond the current state of affairs where a small set of companies is making these decisions. There's kind of this idea that the United Nations has sustainable development goals around, the treatment of women, provisioning of, food and clean water, et cetera, that it might be high time to have some other priorities in there. And I've kind of floated the idea of maybe one of them being some sort of a committee around steering the trajectory of intelligence. So what futures are worth exploring, testing, putting a foot in the water, what futures are not even worth walking down in terms of their dangers and in terms of what we see, and what futures should we be excited to get to? Maybe there's something around curing diseases or whatever the case may be that we say, okay, as an international community, we want to go there. So an intelligence trajectory sort of committee, and then something else, another maybe priority there around steering and transparency. So who might be violating some of these rules here? Who might be leading us astray from some of the things we really wanted to avoid in terms of those undigestible risks to all of humanity. Do you see it emerging as something similar, or would you completely draw up a different way of representing this?
I think this is kind of too specific or too detailed. I kind of like endorse people thinking along those lines and kind of looking around and seeing like what is the local thing that they can be doing for us to have like better chances of survival of this decade. And it's like I think that I see like a lot of goodwill around the world. I mean, I just listened to the Senate hearing with Yoshua Bengio and Stuart Russell and Dario Amodei, and that was like really good.
It was great.
Yeah, and that's like in Europe, more and more politicians are kind of interested in this topic. UK is apparently preparing for some international summit on AI. So there are like a lot of hopeful signs. Of course, like traditionally, like we have like screwed up in many ways when it comes to global issues. Like a lot of people are currently looking at what happened exactly with the nuclear. In some ways, things went okay so far, at least, but it's very plausible that they could have gone much, much better. And like the risk of nuclear disaster could have been much lower in the last 80 years.
I'm with you there. Fortunately, we haven't had a global catastrophe, but even today in this day and age, we have these overt threats still with nuclear as a real risk hanging over humanity's head, which is a little bit less than ideal.
I suggest FLI, the Future of Life Institute, just recently did this video called I'm blanking out on the name, artificial delegation or something like that. Or artificial escalation. I think artificial escalation. Which was about delegating decision-making in kind of international nuclear-equipped militaries.
Yeah. Plenty of good stuff on FLI's website, but probably a lot of the people that tune in here are in some way, shape, or form following them on some social platform. I'll wrap on some of I think one of the great things about your perspective is it's extremely measured, extremely deliberate, very much not dogmatic. And your thinking has changed even since you and I have chatted last, because you're reading everything, you're involved in these groups. So I think your perspective here in closing is going to be really valuable. From what I can tell from the conversation, maybe you're somewhere in the collaboration realm, although you have sympathies with libertarian, you're somewhere more in the collaboration realm, and really very much not in the let's get to ascension space right now. Maybe eventually you see that as worthy, but it sounds like you're more in kind of the row number 2 around more of the progression, but leaning more conservative because of risks. Does that sound somewhat accurate?
Well, I grew up in a country that was built on an ideology. So I think it's not great to just
pin
have
yourself
an
to
ideology
one.
and like...
Sure.
Yeah, your brain on ideology is not great.
Yeah. Well, I very much in the same camp in that regard here. The dogmatism is not something I put up with tremendously well on the show. Mm-hmm. So floating somewhere there, but keeping yourself fluid, being able to change your mind, something you're clearly capable of, something I think is actually pretty important for people who really want to steer some parts of the future. You've made some pretty good arguments for the people who want to really go pedal to the metal, who are just like, this is going to be great for humanity. If you were going to nutshell what you'd want that crowd to know, the crowd that's on that bottom right corner, really about accelerationism, maybe they say they care about humanity, and maybe they do, but they just really don't see the risk. It's just, this is going to make things better, just like past technological developments. Mm-hmm. What's the core argument that you think is most compelling to just get them to adjust their thinking? What do you think they need to consider most?
I think it's kind of like from outside, it's important to just kind of like make a difference between people in that corner. Like, sure. Why are they in that corner? Are they there because they have like ideology and they cannot think? Or is it, or they actually is doing some conscious choice, that thinking that the current world is not very worthwhile? And so even a tiny chance of a glorious future is kind of like worth taking as quickly as possible. And obviously, like, I'm kind of, the latter position is something that you can kind of like reason with and argue with and yes. Trade with. Whether like if you just follow a blind, if you're a blind follower of an ideology, you cannot be traded with easily. Absolutely.
So an important distinction to make. And certainly there are some people there that are there for conscious choice. 30 mm-hmm. seconds if you have anything to say to the final camp as we wrap up here. There's going to be some folks who are really against any AI development at all. And again, some of them are dogmatic, some of them are open-minded, but they're saying, hey, that handing of the baton, like Hinton mentioned, is just too dangerous. Any tinkering with AI, even at the level of today's development, leaning into that progression stage is just morally wrong. There is no good in the blooming of post-human future. It's already too much risk. Talk about 2%. How about talk about 0%? That's the perspective of some people who do have a good heart and are in the right place. But I know that's not exactly your position. What would you say to them in closing?
Sorry, can I say, like, I kind of lost the...
Sure. The people who are purely on the conservative preservation side, zero tinkering into transhumanism, zero tinkering into strong AI, and they've thought it through, and they're just of the belief that really is where humanity needs to stay, even if we have to be authoritarian to get there. Anything you'd share with them in terms of open-minded thinking that maybe they should consider?
So basically, I'm very sympathetic with them in the short term. Because, like, again, we have like cancer, we need chemotherapy or something like that. Humanity has cancer and might need to do something very uncomfortable. But of course, we might have to make sure that the cure is not worse than the disease. So like, obviously, with things like kind of like authoritarian control, we might run into the risk of like this being locked in, and then just the future we can eventually petering out as sufficient big rock hits this planet, because we stop doing technology, etc., which we kind of have to in order to realize the potential that humanity has.
I like it. And the asteroid example, I think, is pretty salient as well. And I know that's all we have for time, but Jaan, it's been a pleasure being able to chat with you again. It's been quite some time. I look forward to following your work. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. A big thank you to Jaan, and thank you to you for being able to tune in all the way through to the end of this episode. This interview is very indicative of the changes in the world since the last time I spoke with Jaan. I'll link to our original interview 4 or 5 years ago at the World Government Summit in Dubai, down in the show notes below. That episode is much more about blooming intelligence into the galaxy and having AI do things that humans never could. This episode is obviously much more about near-term risk, and I think that's indicative of the shift in how far along we are towards artificial general intelligence and the shift in Jaan's own thinking, concerns for his own mortality, that of his children, etc. So curious for me to be able to see that shift. Cool for you guys to be able to see it. I'll link to the past interview in the show notes. Also, Jaan spoke a bit about some of his kind of policy thoughts for where we might need to go. All things considered, I think his ideas are rather well-rounded. He has a list of those ideas on his personal website. I will link to those in the show notes as well. We're going to be continuing this series next time on destinations, thinking about those man-machine futures. Where do we ultimately want to go? We'll keep pulling up the intelligence trajectory political matrix. And I won't tell you the name of our next guest, but he may or may not be the only AGI researcher who regularly wears silly hats. So you'll have to guess on that one. And I'll catch you next time here on The Trajectory.